In the first part, I told you that we are going to go deep. Some of you might be thinking, how deep can we go? After all, glam isn't even skin deep. It's just about wearing flamboyant clothes. Well, in today's video, we are going to ask, is wearing clothes ever just about wearing clothes? The answer, of course, is no. Your clothes are not just meant to keep you warm, they also signify your identity. This has been true throughout the history of human civilization, and naturally we cannot cover all of this history. What we are going to tell here is specifically the story of male dress code, specifically in England, and specifically how it was appropriated by the youth culture of the rock and roll generation. But to understand it, we need to go back, all the way back to the end of the Middle Ages. At that time, the European noblemen moved from fighting one another to protect their own estates into being all part of the royal court. And the courtly, aristocratic society that developed regarded itself as different from the masses. While the common folk were regarded as little more than animals, the noblemen did everything they could to distance themselves from the animal, developing manners and codes that distinguished them as gentlemen. To be a gentleman was to be elevated above man. This society kept becoming gentler and gentler throughout the centuries, culminating in the very genteel courts of the 18th century. The aristocratic gentleman of the 18th century did everything he could to hide his biology behind his fashion. He would apply heavy makeup, he would adorn his head with a fancy wig, he would disguise his body odor with perfume, and he would wear layers of extravagant clothes that would conceal his figure. His manners and speech were very measured, to show full control over his emotions. In such ways, the aristocracy maintained its sense of superiority over the vulgar common man. The aristocrats were also more cosmopolitan than the common folk, having more in common with foreign noblemen than they did with their own countrymen. In England, in the middle of the 18th century, the most foppish gentlemen developed a style that adopted continental influences, in dress and in speech. In food as well. They acquired a taste for Italian pasta, and were therefore nicknamed macaronis. The macaronis became notorious for being gentlemen who were so stylish and genteel that they became effeminate. Around that time, Britain was involved in the so-called French and Indian War, where British soldiers fought side by side with American colonials. The Brits, naturally, felt culturally superior to their American counterparts, and one expression for it can be found in a song that they composed, to a pre-existing tune.
Yankee Doodle came to town a-riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni.
In other words, the Yankee is so stupid and uncivilized that he thinks that a feather in his cap and a pony make him a stylish gentleman. The chorus went,
Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy, mind the music and the step and with the girls be handy.
It is unclear what the word dandy means here. It was probably some pejorative. But the Americans liked it. In no time, they adopted the song, added verses of their own, and turned it into a song of pride in Yankee simplicity in the face of those stuck-up Englishmen. And the term Yankee Doodle Dandy became a symbol of patriotic pride. And so, the word dandy came to signify a man who takes pride in his own style of clothing. But it stands for more than that. From the beginning, as we can see, it signified a man who is mocked by others for his style, but takes the scornful things said about him and wears them with pride. It is a form of rebellion, of being an eyesore to society. and as the word travelled back to England, it would have quick and long-lasting effects. Great Britain, at the time, was ruled by King George III, and he was a little bit cuckoo. He suffered from a mysterious mental disorder and had bouts of insanity. Talks of making his son regent began in the 1780s, but were not acted upon, even though the disorder got worse as he got older. By the turn of the century, it became obvious that he would not be able to rule much longer, and the Prince of Wales became the strong man in the court. In 1811, he was finally made regent, and in 1820, after the death of his father, he became King George IV, and ruled until his own death in 1830. Those first 3 decades of the 19th century are remembered in the annals of Britannia as the Regency years, even though only the middle decade was actual regency. It is a sign of George IV's unpopularity that history remembers him as regent, not king. These were also the years of the Industrial Revolution, which gradually turned the middle class into the strongest class. And the first half of the Regency years were the years of the Napoleonic Wars, which spread the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. Britain did not have a revolution, but the weakness of the crown in those years allowed the parliament to incrementally gain more and more power. The aristocracy, led by the regent himself, reacted to these changes by withdrawing into its own world, oblivious and detached from the progress brought about by the industrialization. They were losing power, but they still regarded themselves as superior, and had to find a way to manifest that superiority. They did it through dandyism. The father figure of all dandies, and one of the main figures of that period, was Beau Brummell. Brummell was not of noble blood, but his parents were civil servants to the upper class, and he grew up within aristocratic circles. Born in 1778, at a time when the aforementioned social transitions were beginning to take place, the young Brummell became a role model to all British aristocrats, including the regent, who was his close friend. Under his influence, the aristocratic wardrobe underwent a radical transformation, updating it to the new reality. He was the original dandy, and he laid down the basic principles to all the dandies to come. Brummell's style was based, first of all, on cleanliness. He did not use any makeup or perfume. Instead, he made sure to be completely clean and odorless. His clothes did not hide his figure, but were rather fit to his form, which meant that he had to be in good physical shape to look good. And there was no excess in his wardrobe. It was quite austere, but everything had to be put together just right. He would spend hours every day getting himself ready, to dazzle everyone come evening and nighttime. Regency aristocrats no longer dressed completely different from the commoners. As the bourgeoisie started to emerge as a dominant class, it was their simple style that became more socially prominent, and the noblemen followed suit. Therefore, to display their superiority, it was now the preciseness in which they wore their clothes that set them apart. Everything had to be measured by the millimeter, and only those with a superior sense of fashion could get it right. The key word was the French word ton, which basically means that you have to get the tone right, if you want to be considered part of the bon ton, of those with good taste. The dandy noblemen were an exclusive group, and you always had to get it right if you wanted to belong. One little mistake would destroy your standing forever. This high society had its own literature and its own newspapers, and you had to follow them to be up to date with the latest fashion. The dandies had their own exclusive clubs, where they would spend their nights impressing each other. Most of them had a nickname that distinguished them, based on their personal proclivities. Since they did not work, and dedicated their life to just looking good, they were a sore in the eyes of the rest of society, a society that started to think through the logic of capitalism, and regarded them as social parasites. And the regent, who was one of the dandies, was despised along with them. In the 1830s, after the death of George IV, a new group of British writers emerged, which was decidedly scornful towards the dandies. These writers promoted a new idea of a gentleman, not someone who is distinguished by his clothes and manners, but by his values. A gentleman is someone who lives by the middle-class values of being a family man, working to support his family, conducting his affairs in an honest way, living modestly, staying away from sin, and being a good Christian and a productive member of society. The dandies, for them, were a symbol of the degeneracy of the aristocracy, which we should aspire to overcome as a country. In 1832, the Parliament passed the Reform Act, which effectively made the people the sovereign of the land. The popularity of the royal family was in the dumps after George IV, and the reign of his brother, William IV, didn't do much to help its image. But William died in 1837 and was succeeded by Queen Victoria, who accepted the new situation. Victoria transformed the role of the monarchy. No longer was its job to rule the country. This is the job of the elected parliament. Instead, the monarchy was to act as a symbol of British values, and British values were now dictated by the middle class. Victoria dressed modestly, as befit the figurehead of these new national values. In the 1840s, those aforementioned writers, which in the 30s wrote mainly for newspapers, became novelists, and were among the main trendsetters of the Victorian age. Those were the glory years of literature, the moment when it became serious art. At a time when philosophers described human society as an organic body that strives to achieve its own perfection, the novelists, all across Europe, started to write large books that attempted to encompass human society and show its different conflicting sides. This was a worldview that was very different from the old aristocratic idea that there is a group of people who are above the rest, and the society of the time defined itself against this old worldview. In Britain, this meant that gentlemen now dressed in a very drab way, the polar opposite of the aristocratic flair. The dandy, once seen as a symbol of masculinity, was now perceived as effeminate and androgynous, a symbol of decadence. In the Victorian novel, the dandy is always the antagonist, the one who stands against society. But in France, in those years, a different attitude emerged. The monarchy was restored in 1815, after the final defeat of Napoleon, but 1830, the year that saw the end of the Regency in Britain, was yet another revolutionary year in France. After an uprising that overthrew King Charles X, the new monarch, Louis Philippe, announced that he is not the king of France, but the king of the French. France became a constitutional monarchy, in which the king rules according to the law set by the people. The bourgeoisie were setting the tone, constructing a society very similar to the Victorian society in Britain. Except that here, artists set themselves apart from the society, and the dandy, for novelists and poets, became a hero. Beau Brummel was reimagined in France as a rebel, one who refuses to bow to the dictations of the bourgeoisie. The dandy, said the French artists, is the one who stands out, the one who constructs himself by his own rules, the one who seeks the beauty of the present and not some eternal ideal, the one who traverses the boring sexuality of the bourgeoisie with his ambiguous sexuality, the one who uses his wit to criticize and mock middle-class values, the one who dresses up to display his originality and creativity. In the face of a society that saw itself as one organic whole, encompassing all of its members, the dandy was a symbol of the individualist who refuses to be encompassed. Thus, a new aristocracy was formed, not determined by blood, but by the ability to distinguish yourself from the crowd. The dandy aestheticized his existence, imposed his own rules on his life, and did not bow to the common values of society. He was there to remind everyone about how boring the bourgeoisie life is. And society was annoyed by the dandy, indeed. We have to remember that, for most people of the time, nice clothes were a luxury, so dandyism was seen as the epitome of vanity, idleness, and decadence. Queen Victoria ruled Britannia until her death in 1900. In the last 2 decades of her rule, though, the Prince of Wales became the more dominant figure in the court, and then he ruled as King Edward VII until his own death in 1910. His reign marked the last flowering of aristocratic flamboyance, before the 20th century marginalized the aristocrats for good. But even in his time, it wasn't the high class that set the tone. The middle class was now robust, after a century in which it was steadily growing. The late Victorian era saw the loosening of Victorian morals, as the middle class was ready to have some fun, and artists once again celebrated dandyism in all its forms. One of these forms was a new form, as dandyism became associated with that new identity that was born in the late 19th century, that of the homosexual. After this period, however, dandyism stopped mattering in Europe for several decades. It was now expected from artists to be dandies, and it wasn't shocking anymore. The ones who did manage to shock were the homosexual dandies, but we are going to dedicate a whole chapter to gays and gay culture, so I'm not going to dwell on it here. The cultural center now moved to America. What pushed America to the front was its pioneering spirit, as it was manifested, for instance, in the many inventors that worked in the country. In the 19th century they made major technological breakthroughs, and by the 20th century these breakthroughs put the US on top. In the 1910s, just as Europe descended into decades of bloodshed, chaos and totalitarianism, these new technologies became good enough to produce the mediums of radio, cinema and recorded music, mediums that were the basis of the American pop culture that was soon to conquer the world. In America there was no history of class struggle between aristocrats and bourgeoisie, so clothes didn't have the same significance. But dandyism soon played a part. As new waves of immigrants started to come, there were ethnic minorities who wanted to partake in the American dream, but were rather destitute. When they did come upon cash, sometimes through illegal means, they often expressed it through clothes. Such was the case with the gangsters who rose to prominence in the 1920s, the Prohibition years. As they became rich, they developed their own style, and in the American mind, dandyism became linked to outlaws. In pop culture, the gangster took the place of the Wild West gunslinger as the main American criminal folk hero. Since they provided the public with booze, they gained a lot of public sympathy, and in the 30s, the years of the Great Depression, they symbolized the individual who stands up to the failed system. In Hollywood, this was manifested in a new genre, the gangster flick. The archetypal movie was Little Caesar, from 1931, in which Edward G. Robinson plays Enrico Bandello, a character modeled on the gangster Al Capone. Here he is early in the movie, as he arrives at the big city and joins a gang of bootleggers.
All right, come on in and meet the boy.
Sure.
Oh, they're 100% all right. Every one of them. There's Tony Passer. Can drive a car better than any mug in the town. Otero. He's little, but he's the goods all right. Bat Carilla. Killer Peppy. Kid Bean. And this one here, Scabby. What a smart guy he is. Boys. Come on, Tony, wake up. I want you to meet a new guy what's going to be with us. This is,
Caesar Enrico Bandello.
Oh, Little Caesar, huh?
Yeah, sure.
We are seeing an echo of the Victorian division of dandies. Like Regency dandies, every gangster has a nickname, and they all have a distinct style. But they are a bunch of rather imbecilic hoodlums who don't understand the irrationality of their lifestyle. They are basically driven by the desire to have power, and Enrico, who is more self-aware that this is what he wants, soon becomes the Caesar who rules them all. The early gangster flicks depicted the gangsters as Italian or Irish, but the Hays Code of 1934 changed things. The code was written from a progressive point of view, and the progressive view was that culture has nothing to do with the reasons people become criminals. Human nature was seen as universal, so the movies had to give a universal reason why the gangsters turned bad. Some films explained it as the result of human nature, others as a fault of society. What they all had in common was that they all believed to have a superior point of view, from which they can understand gangster behavior. The gangsters, in contrast, were portrayed as irrational people, and their dandyism was part of that irrationality. The stated goal of the movies was to educate the viewers and show them the folly of criminal ways. But everyone knew that this wasn't the real reason why people came to watch these movies. The reason was that through the gangster, you could vicariously experience the thrill of an outlaw life for a while. The gangsters were folk heroes, and their flashy style just added to their aura. I use the word aura, but there is a more appropriate word here. While Regency dandies were all about ton, pop culture dandies are all about being cool. The essence of coolness was distilled from the black experience in America, the way in which some African Americans dealt with their harsh reality. Being cool means being unfazed by things around you, not allowing them to affect your emotions and actions. It's a form of detachment, of not allowing the world to control you but remaining in control of yourself. It usually goes along with dandyism, with determining your own look. When done right, coolness has a strong effect on the people around you, as they feel like they have no way to control you. But it means that you must always keep your self-control, and must always look sharp, because one slip-up might make you lose your cool forever. In the 30s, the movie gangsters were the epitome of cool. But as the decade ended, so did the era of the gangster flicks. Reality was changing. The economy was better, and the US was increasingly more concerned with the war in Europe. A new type of movie hero was needed, and one movie answered the call. The Maltese Falcon, from 1941, features Humphrey Bogart playing the private detective Sam Spade, who walks the line between the law-abiding world and the criminal world, and refuses to play by the rules of any of them. He isn't intimidated by the police or by the criminals, and they both respect him for it. He isn't exactly a dandy, but he doesn't dress in a casual way either. He usually wears a long trench coat, more concealing than flashy. And he isn't irrational like 30s gangsters, but a private detective who uses his intelligence to outsmart the law and the outlaws. It was a new level of cinema cool. In contrast, the criminal dandy is manifested in the figure of Joel Cairo, and he is nothing like 30s movie gangsters. The viewers are made to dislike him right away. First, he is a foreigner. Second, he is squirrely and cowardly. And third, he is a homosexual. The problem was that the Hays Code forbade the portrayal of so-called sexual deviance on the big screen, so the movie could not outright say it. Here is the scene in which Cairo is first introduced. Let's see if there are any clues that might hint that he is gay.
Gardenia.
Quick, darling, in with him.
Will you come in, Mr. Cairo?
You sit down, Mr. Cairo.
Thank you, sir.
Now, what can I do for you, Mr. Cairo?
May a strange offer condolences for your partner's unfortunate death.
Thanks.
Is there, Mr. Spade, as the newspapers imply, a certain relationship between that unfortunate happening and the death a little later of the man Thursby? I beg your pardon, no. More than idle curiosity prompted my question. See, Mr. Spade, I'm trying to recover ornament that, shall we say, has been mislaid.
Yeah, okay, we got it. Like I said, we shall dedicate a chapter to gays, including how they were treated by society and depicted in pop culture. Anyway, as we can see, with the presentation of a new model of cool, comes the denigration of the gangster dandy into something very uncool. These movies that we discussed were all made by Warner Brothers, a studio that specialized in creating working-class heroes. MGM, on the other hand, was all about Hollywood glamour. Here is Clark Gable, the so-called King of Hollywood, in the 1939 movie Idiot's Delight.
It will be amusing, Gertrude.
Oh, I hope so.
If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where Harlem sits? Putting on the Ritz. Spangled gowns upon the bevy of high browns around the levee, all misfits. Putting on the Ritz. That's where each and every Lulu Belle goes. Every Thursday evening in her swell clothes. Round them elbows, come with me. We'll attend a Jubilee and see them bend their last 2 bits. Putting on the Ritz.
The song Putting on the Ritz was written a decade earlier by Irving Berlin, inspired by the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. It pokes fun at the black dandies in the place. Putting on the Ritz essentially means that they are dressing so fancy that it looks like they are trying to wear the Ritz, that very posh hotel in London. Again, we see white America making fun of the dandyism of ethnic minorities, but with the MGM stars the story is more complicated. As we said in the previous chapter, the Hollywood stars were people who came from common origins, but were turned into iconic figures by the studio system. They essentially became the new dandies, those who create their own identity and look. In the same year, Gable starred in another film, which became the biggest Hollywood hit of all time.
You low-down, cowardly, nasty thing, you! They were right. Everybody was right. You aren't a gentleman.
Maybe not a gentleman, but a dandy nonetheless. And it had immediate effect. In 1940, a black busboy from Georgia named Clyde Duncan walked into a local clothing store and insisted that they make him a suit similar to one of the suits Gable wore in Gone with the Wind. The suit looked in place when worn by a Southern gentleman of the 1860s, but in 1940 it looked absolutely outrageous, and the store owner was so amused that he took a photo of Duncan in his suit and sent it to a fashion magazine. And once published, it was quickly adopted by black and Mexican men, who accessorized it some more. Known as the Zoot Suit, the notorious suit became the basis of hipster dandyism in the 40s.
I want a suit with the reach, with the draper shape and stuff, come to look sharp enough to see my sunny gal. I want a reed sleeve with the right stripe and a dress vest with the glad clad in the latest fad, see my sunny gal. I want to look keen, so my dream will say.
Why was it so notorious? Because when the US entered the Second World War, there was shortage of many materials, and people were asked to give up on things and live modestly. The Zoot Suit didn't just use scarce materials, but did it to excess, to be flashy when everyone else was making an effort to be modest. Understandably, it infuriated many people. This led to the so-called Zoot Suit riots, in which zoot-suited minorities would clash with soldiers on leave, who were angry to see what's going on the home front. From there, the Zoot Suit lived on in infamy.
Keen, so my dream will say, ain't I the lucky fella? So keen that he'll scream, baby, you sure look mellow.
We said before that the French artists portrayed the dandy as someone who always looks for the beauty that is unique to that moment, not for an eternal beauty. In that, he goes against what European culture always believed one should aspire to. American pop culture already takes it as a given that the moment is what you should aspire to live in. And it doesn't just look for the beauty of the moment, but for the ecstasy. Jazz musicians did not believe in repeating the same musical creation twice, but that music should be made on the spot, and that it should be hot, taking you to the highest high. When you listen to this wild music, your body is set on an ecstatic dance, and you experience heaven. To say it differently, pop doesn't believe in aspiring for an eternal heaven in the afterlife, but in turning every living moment into heaven. At its finest, Hollywood manages to capture this feeling as well. In the 1946 film Blue Skies, we get a new version of Putting on the Ritz, set to dance by the Grand Master of movie dancing.
Have you seen the well-to-do up and down Park Avenue on that famous thoroughfare with their noses in the air, high hats and arrow collars, white spats and lots of dollars, spending every dime for a wonderful time. Now if you're blue and you don't know,
the first thing that we notice is that we have new lyrics here. It is no longer about making fun of black dandies, but about making fun of the vanity of high society people. But Fred Astaire himself is dressed like a dandy, so the song isn't just about portraying dandyism in a bad light.
Putting on the Ritz, dressed up like $1 million trooper, trying hard to look like Gary Cooper. Super duper, come let's make
Once again, we get to mention that Hollywood stars are the models of existence in the 20th century. The stars were archetypes, which you could emulate and use as a template to create your own identity. Every dandy, the song tells us, wants to look as dapper as Gary Cooper. This is where the lyrics end. From here on, it's all about the artistry of one of the greatest artists of the century. Astaire, here, is the quintessence of pop dandyism. It's not just about detaching from a world that demands of you to work for tomorrow. It's also about setting every moment to rhythm, to achieve ecstasy and joy. He is even the one providing the rhythm section to the song, with his tap shoes and his cane. Then, you can also mold the moment into something beautiful, and Astaire was the one who showed us how dancing should be filmed, how you can use the dancer, the scenery and the camera movement to choreograph something dazzling and spectacular. After the war, things went really drab for a while. The idea was that after we won the war, we need to win the peace as well. In other words, the old middle-class idea of creating a perfect society. The welfare state took over, in the US and in most of the Western world. In the beginning of the 50s, the men had a uniform look, wearing suits and keeping their hair in a military crew cut, signifying that they are down to business. Anyone who was different was seen as suffering from some sort of disorder. But not everyone fell in line. The British upper class still wanted to distinguish themselves from the masses, and in 1948, the fashion industry catered to them by creating the Edwardian suit, inspired by men's fashion in the first decade of the century, under King Edward VII. As we recall, we said that this was the last time that the aristocrats had any social and cultural clout, and the suit was meant to remind them of that. But then, something shocking and unprecedented happened. Working-class teenagers, of the poorer end of the working class, started to purchase the Edwardian suit, and created a group identity around it. By the end of 1953, they became known as Teddy Boys. Why was it so shocking? Well, first of all, because the British working class always despised the dandyism of the upper classes, and saw it as effeminate and vain. But as the upper classes became so drab under the welfare state, dandyism could suddenly be a form of working class rebellion. The British post-war youth was inspired by American culture, and the Edwardian suit reminded them of the Zoot suit. The Teddy Boys appropriated the Edwardian suits, made some changes and added accessories that made them look more like the Zoot suit, started to grow their hair long and stylize it with cream, and became the antithesis of 50s mentality. And this was unfathomable to the prevailing mindset. While aristocratic dandyism was tolerable as a relic of the past that will eventually disappear, the Teddy Boys were something new, which went against the idea of progress towards utopia, and this was unacceptable. How did it negate the idea of progress? Well, first of all, the idea of the welfare state was to help the poor progress and achieve equality and freedom. And here were the youth, the generation that was supposed to represent that future glorious society, wasting their money on expensive suits. Deeper still, progress was supposed to overcome the tribalism of the past and create an enlightened society of free individuals. And here were kids who created a new group identity, a form of tribal dandyism. It was seen as a return to the jungle, a threat to everything that the welfare state was trying to build. The Teddy Boys weren't more violent and criminal than other kids of their age and background, but whenever any of them was involved in misdemeanors, the British press would sensationalize it and blame it on the Ted tribal mentality. The Edwardian suit, in the eyes of the British public, became a symbol of juvenile delinquency and crime, and when the wild and unruly rock and roll music traveled the Atlantic and reached the shores of the British Isles, and was immediately and enthusiastically adopted by the Teds, it came to symbolize everything that the public feared. But there were those who saw new opportunities in this situation. In particular, the fashion industry realized that this opens a new market, and started to create fancy clothes for the working class. By the end of the decade, the teddy boy look wasn't that shocking anymore, and the working class youth itself also went through some changes. Some of the kids who belonged to the more upwardly mobile part of the working class, as well as middle class kids, were not content with rock and roll. They liked modern jazz, that more sophisticated style that came from America. Because of that, they called themselves modernists, and dressed in the dapper style of black jazz musicians. By the early 60s, though, there was a new generation of modernists, teenagers who preferred rock and roll and rhythm and blues, but still dressed in the stylish modernist way. In fact, for some of them, it was all about the clothes. The older modernists regarded them with disdain, seeing them as joiners who have no real understanding of the culture, and scornfully referred to them as mods. But the kids, in true dandy fashion, readily adopted the moniker and wore it with pride, and soon enough, they became their own thing. The mods were a working-class youth subculture, just like the teddy boys. But while the Teds had a uniform look, the mods were individualists. Every mod aspired to be a trendsetter, the one who introduces the latest craze. The mods would scavenge the fashion shops of London to look for clothes that would look cool, and then present them at night in the clubs. They would also introduce new haircuts, new dances, and the newest imports of music from the States. The coolest mods were called faces, and they were the ones who set the new trends, in a weekly competition to stay cool. Soon, the mods formed their own bands, and by the mid-60s they ruled the pop charts. Largely due to their influence, London became the capital of the swinging 60s. The mod subculture started in the early 60s, although it took time before they got noticed. One of the earliest newspaper articles about them appeared in a September 1962 edition of Town magazine, which interviewed 3 of the most noted faces of Stamford Hill. 2 of the faces were 20-year-olds, but the show was stolen by 14-year-old Mark Feld, who was the epitome of the individualistic, competitive, fashionable, live-for-the-moment ethics of the mods. "You got to be different from other kids," he is quoted, but then he adds, "I mean, you got to be 2 steps ahead." So it is not individualism in the sense of separating yourself from the rest of society. The mod always lives within a culture, and cares about the opinions of others, but he aspires to be cooler and sharper than anyone else. One of the first television appearances of mods came in November 1964, on BBC's Tonight Show.
The rebellion of the long hairs is getting underway. They're tired of persecution, they're tired of taunts, they're tired of losing their jobs, they're tired of being sent home from college, they're tired of being sent home from school, they're tired even of being refused the dole. So with the nucleus of some of his friends, a 17-year-old, Davy Jones, has just founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men. Well, here we are. Long-haired men, you've got to have your hair, 9 inches long before you can join?
Well, I think we're past that over now.
Have you?
Yes.
Now, exactly who's being cruel to you?
Well, I think we're all fairly tolerant, but for the last 2 years we've had comments like "darling" and "can I carry a handbag" thrown at us. I think it's just had to stop now.
But does this surprise you that you get this kind of comment? Because after all, you have got really rather long hair, haven't you?
We have, yes. Yeah, it's not too bad, really. No, I like it, and I think we all like long hair. And we don't see why other people should persecute us because...
It'll take a few more years before Mark Feld and Davy Jones would cross paths and become friends, and then a few years more before they gave birth to glam rock. But already we see the difference between them. Mark was an extrovert, who played the mod game to perfection because he was a dandy by nature. Mark was a face, while David wasn't. But David was more calculating. This whole interview is a joke, a publicity stunt to get famous. It showed his ability to get to where he wanted not through style, but through manipulating the media. It didn't work for him in '64, when he was 17 years old, but he would get better in time. A lot better. In the previous chapter, we discussed the Fellini movie La Dolce Vita. We followed the journalist Marcello as he covers the hectic nightlife of the new pop culture, and we noted how he is drawn to the exuberance and irreverence of this Americanized world, but also wonders if there is any substance beneath all the glamour, or is it completely vacuous. And this was in 1960, before the 60s got rolling. London of the middle of the decade was a lot faster and flashier than Marcello's Rome, prompting another Italian director to make a similar statement about it. Blow Up, by Michelangelo Antonioni, follows a photographer who tries to capture the swinging London scene with his camera, and we see him constantly running around from one event to the other, hopelessly trying to keep up. But then, while developing his photos, he realizes that he accidentally captured something more serious. He tries to figure out what it was, but he is so distracted by everything that is going on around him that he loses his chance to make a difference. According to Antonioni, it seems, all substance has been lost in this new pop world. In one of the scenes, the hero stumbles upon a rock concert, a performance by the Yardbirds. This is actually a special and short-lived Yardbirds lineup, containing two legendary guitarists, Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. But the audience isn't into it at all. They are just standing silently, as if waiting for something. We find out what it is in the end, when Beck smashes up his guitar, and the audience goes wild and starts fighting for the pieces. They are not there for the art, they are there for destruction. Our hero wins the tussle and walks away with the memorabilia, but once he is out of the concert, he just throws it away as a piece of junk. Life in the 60s, Antonioni seems to be telling us, is nothing but a succession of disconnected moments, which gratify our base impulses, but lose any significance once they are over. The Yardbirds were one of the leading mod bands, but the quintessential mod band was The Who. The most self-aware mod band, the most self-aware band of the 60s, The Who explicated the pop philosophy of the mods. It was The Who that started the custom of smashing up the instruments at the end of every show, and they did it for the fun of it, but there was also a message there. It was part of the mod belief in the ephemeral nature of everything, and how you must not hold to anything for too long. The Who, in their art, embraced that reality which Antonioni laments. In late 1967, The Who released their third studio album, The Who Sellout. The album is structured like an hour of a top 40 radio show. More specifically, it is Radio London, that beloved pirate station that broadcasted rock and roll for the 60s youth. The hits are all original songs by The Who, and interspersed between them are mock commercials, also written by the band. It is a pure pop art project, manifesting the transient spirit of 60s pop. But the album title, and the fact that it is hard to tell between the songs and commercials, suggests that The Who were getting tired of this haphazard lifestyle. The closing track, Rael, suddenly presents something different. Inspired by the story of the Jewish people, who recently returned to their homeland and managed to liberate it after 2,000 years in which it was occupied by foreign empires, the song is about a man who goes back to the eternal land of his forefathers, a land called Rael, even though it is considered a dangerous place. There is, The Who seems to be telling us, something more everlasting than this top 40 lifestyle, something that we need to find. But the question is, where is Rael?
The yellow flag is flashing, sickly held against the wall. Then you know my courage is ended, and you'll send your boy ashore.
The Who were still treating the question with skepticism. The music of Rael was later developed and became core to their next album, Tommy, from 1969. This is a rock opera about a pop culture messiah who claims to have found the path to everlasting happiness. But he is a false messiah, and the happiness that he offers is only temporary. Even while looking for something more substantial, then, The Who did not abandon their belief that everything is fleeting. Others, however, were not that skeptical. The late 60s saw the rise of many movements that purported to offer the truth that will set us free and take us to the land of eternal happiness. Along with that came a change in attire. The rock world was now ruled by the hippies, who believed it should seek more everlasting truths. Mostly middle class, the hippies despised dandyism and glamour, seen as representing the fake world of appearances. Instead, they let their hair grow wild, a more natural look, and appropriated clothes from cultures that were seen as less modernized and more connected to the earth. By the early 70s, rock musicians dressed in denim, and took themselves very seriously indeed.
She could drag me over the rainbow, send me away. Round by the river, I shot my baby.
Not everyone, however, was willing to accept this turn of events. Let's reconnect with Mark Feld, whom we left in 1962 when he was a 14-year-old face. What has he been up to in the meantime?
Dandy, dandy, we're gonna go now.
Mark, as mentioned, was a natural-born dandy. As a child, he already started to assume characters, and modeled himself mainly after Elvis Presley. At age 11, in the late 50s, he was already dressing up, inspired by the modernists. And he wasn't just dressing up, but customizing his clothes to create his own style, making him a face. But he wasn't content with that. He wanted to be a star, to be a face not just to other mods, but all over the world. He knew that rock and roll was the way to get there, but he didn't have a singing voice. He could have joined a band, but his individualistic nature rejected the notion. He seemed to be stuck, with no way to get to where he wanted. And then came Bob Dylan.
Leave your stepping stones behind, something calls for you.
In Bob Dylan, Mark found a model that he could emulate. Dylan did not have what was considered to be a singing voice, but he showed that he could still sing in a way that moved people. And he was an individualistic hero, writing original songs that lashed against the world, changing rock and roll music and adapting it to his needs. This is what Mark wanted to be. In honor of his hero, he changed his last name, borrowing the beginning and the end of Bob Dylan to create Bolan. He also changed the spelling of his first name, replacing the K with a C, to make it more exotic. Mark Bolan was born. One thing that Bolan shared with Dylan was the ability to tell stories and to mythologize himself. They were both massive fibbers, inventing a fictional biography to glamorize their adopted name. In late 1965, Bolan released his first single, The Wizard. He told the music press that this single was inspired by a man that he met on a trip to Paris, who apparently had magical powers. Except Mark has never been to Paris. This first single is nothing special, but it already hints at the unique mixture of fantasy and the modern urban world, which will typify his future work. Mark put out a couple of more singles, with no success. Around that time, he met and befriended Davy Jones, who was also trying to make it in the rock and roll business, and also changed his last name, becoming David Bowie. The two ambitious mods had big dreams, but were still nowhere near achieving them. On the mod scene, they were just part of the crowd. But, as the title of Mark's third single already hints, the scene was about to change. Hippie Gumbo, released in December 1966, is one of the first record titles to contain the word hippie. It is also notable for featuring Bolan's new singing style, which contains a unique affectation, a certain warble.
Name was Paradise.
It brought him much ridicule, and people said that he sounds like a lamb. After the failure of this single, Mark realized that he will not succeed as a soloist, and decided to try being part of a band. A short stint in a regular rock and roll band did not change his fortunes, but in 1967 he attended a concert by Indian sitar grandmaster Ravi Shankar, a favorite of the hippies, and it gave him an idea. In late '67, Mark teamed up with a percussionist who called himself Steve Peregrine Took and formed the duo Tyrannosaurus Rex, based on an original concept. It borrowed from the Indian style of sitting down and playing tabla and sitar, but instead of tablas, Peregrine Took played bongos, and instead of sitar, Bolan played acoustic guitar. The music also showed a bit of an Indian influence, but more so it had a Celtic vibe. All of this created a strange mystical feel, over which Mark's bleating singing style sounded obscure and intriguing. This music was also very suitable to his writing style, allowing him to write lyrics that delved into the land of fantasy, full of mythical creatures and dreamy girls. One man who was immediately taken over by this mesmeric duo was John Peel, a DJ in Radio London. Peel was known as the underground DJ, the one who was checking out what was cooking on the margins of the rock world and featuring it on his show. At this time, it was the hippie sensibility, and Peel started to promote Tyrannosaurus Rex as a homegrown hippie band. With such backing, they soon got a record contract, and were teamed up with a young American record producer named Tony Visconti, who had a knack for producing creative instrumentation that produced sounds on atmospheres not regular to rock. From 1968, they started to put out albums that were warmly received by the underground. Thus, Tyrannosaurus Rex achieved cult status among the British hippies. But Bolan was never really a hippie. He hardly did any drugs, and his new attire was just another costume. He did dress in the disheveled hippie style, but he did it in a way that was still more elegant than your regular hippie. He was still a dandy, a mod in hippie clothes. The name of the band, too, betrayed fantasies of power, of wanting to be the biggest band of all. Not exactly the hippie attitude. By the second half of 1969, this caused a split in the duo. Steve Peregrine Took was a very talented musician, but also very much a hippie, more into spacing out on drugs than into achieving success in the music business. This did not go well with Mark's ambitions, and he replaced him with a percussionist named Mickey Finn, which was, delightfully, his real name. By that time, the mystical, soothing vibes of the 1967 Summer of Love faded away, and the rock world became a lot harsher. Bolan reacted to it by electrifying the band's sound, although still keeping its style intact. In early '69, David Bowie would sometimes be the warming act for Tyrannosaurus Rex. Bowie also got a record contract in '67, but his first album flopped. Now, through his friendship and work with Bolan, he also teamed up with Tony Visconti, who produced his second album. But there was one song that Visconti refused to work on, regarding it as too pop for his taste, and it was this song that finally gave Bowie some recognition. Space Oddity, a story about an astronaut getting lost in space, became a hit in late '69, fortuitously timed with the Apollo 11 moon landing. Shortly after this success, David got married to a woman named Angie, who shared his grandiose ambitions. To celebrate their nuptials, he wrote a song for her called The Prettiest Star, and decided to make it his follow-up single to Space Oddity. In the first days of January 1970, Bowie went into the studio to record it, and invited Mark Bolan to play lead guitar. As the title suggests, Bowie was thinking about stardom. He is describing a new kind of rock star, and he makes no secret about who the role models for it should be, the movie stars of the golden age of Hollywood. And he believes that, by constructing themselves as such a star, they could rise to the toppermost of the toppermost.
Staying back in your memory are the movies in the dark. How you move is all it takes to sing a song of when I loved the prettiest star. One day, though it might as well be someday, you will rise up high and take us all away, all because of what you are, the prettiest star.
Bowie is singing to Angie here, but he might as well could be singing to Bolan. And Mark reciprocates with a glistening guitar solo, moving away from the ethereal haze of his previous work. Right at the beginning of a new decade, the two friends and rivals announce that they intend to make it their decade. The single flopped, but from here on, the pair would be unstoppable. A month later, Bowie came up with his first ruse of the decade, the first of many that would follow. He was slotted to be the local opening act for a couple of hippie bands from America, one of them being none other than Country Joe and the Fish, one of the original hippie heroes. The rock world, by then, was split. Part of it maintained the original rock and roll elements, but made them dumber, creating catchy pop tunes without any substance, that were dubbed bubblegum music. For the counterculture, this music was abhorrent, the destruction of rock by the greedy music industry. Hippie rock was decidedly anti-commercial, containing bands that put greater emphasis on musicianship and artistic expression, and singer-songwriters who sang earnest and intimate songs that revealed their true emotions. In front of this crowd, Bowie unveiled his new band, which emphasized artificiality and commercialization. Showing his knack for self-awareness, he named this band Hype. Hype was made of 4 members, each with his own persona, wearing costumes tailor-made by Angie Bowie. David was Rainbow Man, dressed in a shiny multicolored suit. Drummer John Cambridge was Cowboy Man. Bowie's new guitarist, Mick Ronson, was Gangster Man. And Tony Visconti, on bass, was Hype Man, dressed in a kind of Superman outfit with a big H imprinted on his chest. The hippie crowd, according to Bowie, was so disgusted that they didn't even bother to boo, but just turned their back on the show. But there was one man in the audience who did like it, someone who knew he could do better. Bowie was an introvert by nature, and this extravaganza didn't go well with his character. But the more flamboyant Mark Bolan was there, at the foot of the stage, watching from the sideline, learning, internalizing, and planning his next move. Bolan's first reaction was to create his own mock band, which existed for only one studio session. In August 1970, he recorded a single as Dib Cochran and the Earwigs. The name seems to be a tribute to Eddie Cochran, the 50s American rock and roll icon and one of Mark's heroes, and it hints at the content. Unlike the Tyrannosaurus Rex stuff, this was simple, old-fashioned rock and roll. But there was something more to it. Tony Visconti added a string section, which made it glitzier. Basically, it was bubblegum music. The single got no notice and disappeared into obscurity, but with hindsight, we see that here is where Bolan and Visconti found their winning formula.
Oh baby, baby, oh baby, baby, oh baby, baby, I want you for my woman. Oh baby, baby, oh baby, baby, oh baby, baby,
really break big, however, a bit of luck was needed, and Bolan got it around that time, when Mungo Jerry's In the Summertime became a huge global hit. The vocals feature the same vibrato effect that he was famous for, and what previously earned him derision now became acceptable. Bolan would be quick to capitalize.
When the weather's fine, you got women on your mind. Have a drink, have a drive, go out and see what you can find.
In October came the single that was to change Mark's fortunes. Ride the White Swan uses pretty much the same imagery of his previous stuff, but sets it to a much simpler and easier to digest sound. With it also came a change in the name of the band, to the shorter and catchier T-Rex. The single became a huge hit, going all the way up to number 2 in the British chart, and T-Rex's fame began to spread.
Ride a white swan like the people of the Belgian, where you headlong, babe, you can't go wrong.
To many in the counterculture, this was a sign that Bolan sold out. It would quickly lead to a breakup with a lot of his former followers and supporters, including John Peel. But many kids had by now tired of hippie seriousness, and perceived it as pretentiousness. Bolan did to the hippie counterculture what the 19th century dandies did to middle-class culture. He looked like them, but with more style, thus mocking their pretensions and presenting a mirror to what they really are. The hippies told themselves that they were transcending the tribalism embodied by youth subcultures like the Teddy Boys and the Mods, that they are wearing clothes that are anti-style, because they represent universal humanity. Bolan was there to remind them that they were actually just another tribe, another fashion statement. He maintained the hippie long hair and freaky clothes, but he wasn't scruffy like them. He was rather slick, reminding the hippie rockers that they, too, are merely doing showbiz. And it was also a sexy look, which the girls did not fail to notice. Mark now quickly moved to turn T-Rex into a fully fledged rock band. He added bassist Steve Curry and drummer Bill Legend, who, like Mickey Finn, were easygoing and did not threaten his dominance as the leader. In February came the next single, Hot Love, which became another big hit, big enough to get T-Rex to play it on Top of the Pops. On March 11, 1971, they appeared on national TV, and history was made.
Well, she's my woman of gold, and she's not below.
It was a last-minute idea, taken just as the band was getting ready to go on, to put some glitter on the Bolan's eyes. They didn't think much of it, but for many of the teeny-bopping viewers, it was a call to arms. For all those kids who were bored by hippie drabness, it gave a way to fight back. Many adopted the glamorous look, taking it to the streets of Britain. Hot Love shot to the number 1 in the chart, and, for many people, this Top of the Pops performance is the moment that glam rock was born.
But she's faster than rust, and she lives on the coast. I'm her two-penny prince, and I give her hot love.
Hot Love was not about unicorns. It was about what rock and roll was about to begin with, about sex. It basically updated 50s rock and roll for the 70s. It had the Tony Visconti string arrangement, which 50s rock and roll did not have, but it was simple and visceral, and purely sexual. Bolan's vocals have been the butt of jokes for years, but by now he honed them down, and his voice became seductive, one of the most recognizable voices in rock history. The next single was once again about sex, but it was even better, and gave T-Rex its biggest hit.
Get
Get It On was released in July, and it constitutes the perfection of the T-Rex style. Mark's lyrics go back to the Chuck Berry brand of poetry, of writing about teenage concerns while throwing in names of contemporary commodities, especially swanky American cars. But he wraps it up in his own phantasmagorical imagery, making teenage life seem chivalrous and otherworldly. Visconti's imaginative production makes it all shine, and Bolan's guttural delivery is spellbinding. The single was another #1 in the UK, and even made it into the top 10 in the US. In September came the album Electric Warrior, in which the power of this new glam rock style is on full display. Needless to say, it too rocketed to #1 on the British chart.
You're windy and wild, you got the blues in your shoes and your stockings. You're windy and wild, oh yeah.
By the end of 1971, the British Isles were in the throes of T-Recstasy, with scenes not witnessed there since the heyday of Beatlemania. Bolan actually had some similarities with the NP2s. Like them, he exuded an air of youthful innocence, which captivated the young. But on top of that, his songs added a dimension of fantasy and magic, which for some kids opened the window into new realms of imagination.
You're so fine. I want you all and everything just to be mine. Show my love, yes, oh, girl, I'm just a cheese for your life.
And the T-Rex monster kept stomping the UK chart in 1972 as well. Bolan and Visconti transformed the band's music into a Wagnerian wall of sound, a powerful metallic machine. In January came Telegram Sam, yet another #1, and it was followed in May by an even bigger hit, the anthemic Metal Guru. Both were taken from the album The Slider, another glam classic released in July. Nothing, it seemed, could stop Bolan and T-Rex. But by the time The Slider saw light, someone had already stolen T-Rex's thunder, someone a lot shrewder. Bolan was the first glam rocker to make it all the way to the top, but a lot of it was just instinct and luck. He didn't really know what he was doing. But all the while, the more cerebral David Bowie was watching from the sideline, learning, internalizing, and planning his next move.